It was a warm afternoon at Greenfield Park as children played, families picnicked, and scents of fresh grass and barbecue filled the air, creating a warm, vibrant atmosphere of comfort and community. Elijah, a 15-year-old black boy with a quiet demeanor, sat on the chair every day, rain or shine. His frame was slight but strong, his brown skin glowing under the dappled sunlight. A worn paperback rested in his hands as he flipped through its pages, occasionally looking up to gaze at the horizon. The ritual wasn't random. It was deeply intentional. This chair was more than a spot to rest. It was where Elijah's mother, Melanie Brooks, had spent her final moments before tragedy struck. 5 years ago, a stray bullet from a police officer's accidental discharge during a routine patrol had ended Melanie's life. The community had mourned her loss deeply, but no one had felt the pain more than Elijah and his father, Chief Daniel Brooks. Melanie's death had left a void in their lives that neither words nor time could fill. For Elijah, the chair was a connection to his mother, a place where her laughter had once blended with the park's vibrant sounds. It was his way of keeping her memory alive. The park regulars had grown used to Elijah's presence. Many admired his quiet strength, understanding the significance of his daily visits. A few would offer a polite nod or smile in passing, respecting his unspoken need for solitude. Some parents pointed him out to their children as an example of discipline and focus, but not everyone shared that sentiment. Heather Morgan, a white woman in her late 30s, often came to the park with her terrier, Bentley. She had only recently started dating Daniel Brooks, unaware of the full extent of his family's history. Heather noticed Elijah each time she visited. To her, his presence seemed odd, even suspicious. What teenage boy sat alone in a park every single day, always on the same chair? It unnerved her. Heather told herself it wasn't about his race, though deep down, unexamined biases stirred within her. She convinced herself that she was concerned for the safety of the community. Surely, someone sitting in the same spot day after day couldn't be doing something innocent. Elijah remained oblivious to the growing unease of the woman who watched him from across the park. His focus was on the book in his lap and the memories the chair held. For him, this place was not just a chair in a park. It was a sanctuary, a reminder of love lost but never forgotten. Heather Morgan loved Greenfield Park for its tranquility and charm. Every afternoon, after a busy day of showing properties, she strolled through the park with her golden retriever, Max, soaking in the peace it offered. To her, the park was more than a green space. It was a symbol of the ideal suburban life she sold to her clients. Families gathered for picnics, children giggled as they raced along the trails, and neighbors greeted each other warmly. Heather had moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago, and this park quickly became her refuge. But recently, her walks had begun to feel less peaceful. Her attention was frequently drawn to a boy who always sat in the same spot under the shade of an old oak tree. At first, she barely noticed him. He was just another teenager, quietly reading a book. Yet as days turned into weeks, his consistent presence began to unsettle her. Heather prided herself on being observant, a necessary skill for her work in real estate, and the boy's habit of sitting in the same chair every day seemed peculiar. He rarely interacted with anyone. He didn't run around or play sports like the other kids. He simply sat there, day after day, his head bent over a worn paperback or staring off into the distance. It started as a mild curiosity. Why does he come here every day? She wondered aloud one afternoon as she passed him. But soon, her curiosity grew into unease. To her, his silent presence seemed almost like an intrusion into the park's harmony. It was as though his stillness clashed with the lively energy around him. It wasn't long before Heather's mind began to fill in the blanks. She wondered if he was watching the children, or maybe he was loitering, scouting the park for some nefarious purpose. On one particularly warm afternoon, Heather met her friend Lisa for coffee. As they chatted about life and work, Heather brought up her concerns. "There's this boy at the park," she said, stirring her iced latte. "He's there every single day, sitting in the same chair. It's just odd. I can't put my finger on it, but it doesn't feel right." Lisa, a mother of 2 young boys, raised an eyebrow. "Every day? That does sound strange. Is he bothering anyone?" "No, not directly," Heather admitted. But he doesn't fit. He's always alone, just sitting there. It makes me uncomfortable. Lisa leaned back in her chair, her lips pursed. Maybe he's up to something. You hear stories all the time about teenagers hanging around parks, causing trouble. You should keep an eye on him. Heather nodded, feeling a sense of validation. Her unease now seemed justified, even urgent. You're right. I mean, it's probably nothing, but it's better to be cautious. From that moment, Heather began to pay closer attention to the boy. She noted his arrival time, the way he carried himself, and the way he avoided engaging with others. She didn't know his name, but in her mind, she started to piece together a narrative. He must be troubled, she thought, or worse, dangerous. Her biases, long buried beneath a veneer of suburban politeness, began to surface. One Saturday afternoon, as Heather walked Max through the park, she spotted the boy again. He was sitting in his usual spot, his face partially hidden behind the book he was reading. She felt a flicker of annoyance. The park was supposed to be a place of joy and community, and yet here he was, a constant reminder of something she couldn't quite define but knew she didn't like. This time, Heather lingered, watching him from a distance. Her irritation grew as she observed him. Why did he have to come here every day? Why couldn't he sit somewhere else, or better yet, stay home? She noticed other park-goers glancing at him, too, some with curiosity, others with subtle judgment. To Heather, their stares confirmed her feelings. She wasn't the only one who found him out of place. As she watched, a thought crept into her mind. What if he's a threat? It was a fleeting notion, but once it took root, it refused to let go. Heather began to feel a sense of duty. She had to act, not just for herself but for the community. After all, wasn't it her responsibility to protect the park, to ensure it remained a safe and welcoming space for everyone? Heather decided to take matters into her own hands. The next day, as she prepared for her walk, she rehearsed what she might say if she confronted the boy. She would be firm but polite, she told herself. She would ask him why he was always there, why he chose that particular spot. Maybe she would even suggest he move to another part of the park. But when she arrived and saw him sitting there, her confidence faltered. Something about his calm demeanor made her hesitate. He wasn't doing anything wrong, not technically. Yet the sight of him stirred something in her, a mix of frustration and unease she couldn't fully articulate. Unable to summon the courage to confront him directly, Heather resolved to escalate the situation. A few days later, as she walked Max past the boy's usual spot, she pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed 911. The operator's voice on the other end was calm and professional. "There's a boy at Greenfield Park," Heather said, her voice low but firm. "He's here every day, sitting in the same spot. It's making people uncomfortable. I think he might be up to something." The operator asked for details, and Heather provided them, her words tinged with a mix of conviction and uncertainty. When the call ended, she slipped her phone back into her pocket and glanced toward the boy. He hadn't moved, seemingly unaware of what was about to unfold. Heather felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with nerves. She believed she had done the right thing, that she was protecting her beloved park and its visitors. Yet deep down, a small voice whispered doubts she wasn't ready to confront. As she waited for the police to arrive, Heather glanced around the park. Parents watched their children, couples strolled hand in hand, and the world continued as if nothing was wrong. But to Heather, the boy's presence was a problem she had taken it upon herself to solve. She straightened her posture, her resolve hardening. Soon, she thought, everything would be set right. What she didn't know was that her call would set in motion a series of events that would not only shatter her perception of the boy, but also force her to confront the prejudice lurking in her own heart. It was a warm, breezy afternoon at Greenfield Park when Heather Morgan's decision to act reached its tipping point. Standing near the playground with her golden retriever, Max, she watched the boy, Elijah Brooks, sitting in his usual chair under the oak tree. Heather's unease had been building for weeks, and now, armed with the conviction that she was doing the right thing, she finally acted. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911, but her voice was steady, assertive. "Greenfield Park," she said to the operator. "There's a young man here. He's been coming every day, sitting in the same spot. It's suspicious. He's making people uncomfortable. I think someone should come check it out." The operator asked for more details, but Heather kept her answers vague. She described Elijah's daily presence as loitering and hinted that he might be involved in something shady. Satisfied that she had conveyed her concerns, she ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. Max barked and tugged at his leash, but Heather's focus remained on Elijah, her gaze sharp with determination. Around her, the park buzzed with life. Families laid out picnic blankets, and children squealed with delight on the swings. Elijah, oblivious to the brewing storm, sat calmly, his nose buried in a tattered paperback. His face was peaceful, his posture relaxed, a stark contrast to Heather's rigid stance as she paced back and forth, awaiting the arrival of the police. Minutes later, the faint sound of sirens broke through the hum of the park. Heather's heart raced as a black and white police car pulled up near the entrance. The crowd began to take notice, their conversations quieting as two officers stepped out. A tall male officer with a firm jawline and a shorter female officer whose expression carried both professionalism and curiosity. Heather waved them over, her steps brisk as she approached. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "It's that boy over there." She pointed toward Elijah, who was still seated under the tree. "He's been here every day, sitting in the same chair. He's making people uncomfortable. I think he might be up to something." The male officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding, his tone measured. "What exactly has he done, ma'am?" Heather hesitated for a moment, her confidence faltering under the weight of the question. "Well," she stammered, "he hasn't done anything yet. But he's always here, every single day, and it's just odd. People are starting to feel uneasy." The female officer raised an eyebrow, her gaze drifting toward Elijah. "Has he threatened anyone? Is he behaving aggressively?" "No, not exactly," Heather admitted, her voice lowering. "But you can't be too careful these days. He's just sitting there, watching." The male officer sighed, clearly skeptical, but he nodded. "All right, ma'am. We'll go talk to him." Heather followed a few steps behind as the officers approached Elijah. The boy looked up from his book, his expression one of mild surprise but not fear. He didn't seem the least bit alarmed by their presence. "Good afternoon, son," the male officer said, his tone neutral. "We got a call about you. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Elijah blinked, then glanced down at the book in his lap. "I'm reading," he said simply. The female officer crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "Do you come here often?" she asked, her voice softer than her partner's. "Yes," Elijah replied. "Every day. This is my spot." Heather, standing at a distance, crossed her arms tightly over her chest. To her, Elijah's calm demeanor was infuriating. He wasn't defensive or apologetic. He wasn't reacting the way she expected someone caught in the act to react. Instead, he was composed, unbothered even. "And why this spot?" the male officer pressed. "Why here every day?" Elijah hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. He took a deep breath before answering. "Because this is where my mom used to sit." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions softening slightly. The crowd that had begun to gather murmured quietly, intrigued by the unfolding scene. Elijah continued, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "She used to bring me here when I was little. We'd sit on this chair and watch the ducks or read together. But she died here. 5 years ago. There was an accident." Heather's brow furrowed, her arms tightening further around herself. She hadn't expected this. The boy's story was simple yet poignant, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of doubt. Was it possible she'd been wrong? The female officer nodded gently. "I'm sorry to hear that, Elijah, but you're not doing anything wrong by sitting here. You know that, right?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I just like being here. It reminds me of her." The crowd murmured again, some faces turning sympathetic. Parents with children glanced at Elijah, their expressions softening as the weight of his words settled over them. But Heather's discomfort only deepened. To her, the boy's story felt manipulative, a convenient excuse to justify his suspicious behavior. She stepped forward, her voice sharper than before. "I don't mean to be rude," she said, addressing the officers, But we can't just take his word for it. There's no way to verify what he's saying. And even if it's true, why does he have to be here every single day? It's unsettling for the rest of us." The male officer frowned, clearly annoyed by her persistence. "Ma'am, unless this young man is breaking the law or threatening someone, there's no reason for us to intervene." "But," Heather began, only to be cut off by the sound of a new car pulling into the park. This vehicle wasn't a standard police cruiser. It was a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, its presence exuding authority. The car door opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. His posture was tall and confident, his expression unreadable. Heather's eyes widened as she recognized him. It was Chief Daniel Brooks, her boyfriend. As he strode toward the group, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Elijah's head snapped up, his face lighting with a mixture of relief and surprise. "Dad?" he said quietly. The crowd fell silent. Heather froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Dad?" She turned her gaze from Elijah to Daniel, confusion and dread spreading across her face. The pieces began to click together in her mind, and the realization hit her like a freight train. The boy she had called the police on, the boy she had accused of being a threat, was her boyfriend's son. Daniel's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the officers, the crowd, and finally Heather. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was low but firm. "Someone want to explain what's going on here?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Heather felt her stomach drop as she realized the enormity of what she had done. The truth, now undeniable, hung heavy in the air. This was not going to end the way she had expected. The air in the park seemed to freeze as Chief Daniel Brooks stepped into the unfolding scene. His broad shoulders and no-nonsense expression commanded attention, and the murmuring crowd instinctively fell silent. The two officers stood straighter as he approached, their hands resting lightly on their belts, but their eyes betrayed a mixture of relief and hesitation. This was no longer a simple incident. They were now standing in the presence of their boss. Daniel's gaze swept over the crowd before landing on his son, Elijah, who was sitting on the same weathered wooden chair under the oak tree. His expression softened, the stern lines of his face easing into something closer to concern. Then he turned his attention to Heather, who stood frozen, her face a mixture of confusion and dread. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. The male officer cleared his throat and stepped forward. "We received a call about a potential disturbance, Chief. When we arrived, we found this young man sitting here. He explained that he comes here every day to honor his late mother." He paused, glancing at Heather. The caller felt his presence was unsettling. Daniel's eyes flicked back to Heather, and in that moment, the unspoken connection was clear. Heather felt a wave of heat rush to her face, her stomach twisting in knots. "He knows," she thought, her heart pounding in her chest. "He knows I'm the one who called." "Elijah," Daniel said, his tone softening as he turned to his son. "Are you okay?" Elijah nodded. "I'm fine, Dad. I was just reading like I always do." The tension in Daniel's shoulders eased slightly, but his expression darkened as he looked back at Heather. "Elijah, why don't you tell everyone here why you sit in this chair every day?" Heather's throat tightened as Elijah hesitated, his eyes darting toward the crowd that had gathered around them. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the edges of his book, before speaking. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet pain beneath his words. "This is where my mom used to sit," he began, his gaze fixed on the chair beneath him. "She used to bring me here all the time when I was little. We'd sit here together, reading, talking, or just watching the ducks in the pond. It was her favorite spot." The crowd listened intently, their curiosity shifting to sympathy as Elijah continued. His voice grew softer, and the raw emotion in his words seemed to hang in the air like a heavy mist. "5 years ago, she was sitting here, right here on this chair," he said, his fingers brushing the worn wood. There was an accident, a stray bullet from an argument across the street. She was hit before anyone even realized what had happened." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "She died right here, in this park." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief and pity. Parents held their children a little closer, and some even wiped at their eyes. Heather felt her breath hitch as the weight of his story settled over her. She glanced at Daniel, whose face was etched with both sorrow and pride as he looked at his son. "I come here every day," Elijah continued, "because it's the only way I feel close to her. Sitting here, in her spot, it helps me remember her. It's not much, but it's all I have left." Elijah's voice broke slightly on the last word, but he quickly composed himself, sitting up straighter. He avoided looking at the crowd, his focus shifting back to his book as though he hoped it might shield him from their stares. The female officer cleared her throat, her voice gentle as she addressed Elijah. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Elijah. I can't imagine how hard that must be for you." Elijah nodded, but didn't reply. His quiet dignity in the face of such profound pain struck a chord with many in the crowd. Whispers of sympathy passed among them, and several onlookers shot disapproving glances at Heather. It was clear now that the boy wasn't a threat or a nuisance. He was simply a grieving son trying to preserve a connection to his mother. But Heather, standing stiffly near the officers, couldn't bring herself to meet anyone's gaze. Her chest felt heavy, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had come here today convinced that she was doing the right thing. But now she wasn't so sure. Her mind raced as she tried to reconcile her assumptions about Elijah with the reality of his story. "I didn't know," she muttered under her breath, though no one seemed to hear her. Daniel's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Heather," he said, his tone cold and sharp, "you didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. You saw a boy sitting on a chair and decided that made him a problem." Heather flinched at the accusation, her face flushing with shame. I thought." "You thought wrong," Daniel cut her off, his voice rising slightly. "Elijah isn't just some boy sitting on a chair. He's my son. And this chair isn't just a piece of furniture. It's where his mother died." He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You judged him without knowing a damn thing about him, or about us." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, their disapproval directed squarely at Heather. She felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes. She wanted to explain herself, to defend her actions, but no words came. Instead, she stood there, paralyzed by the crushing realization of what she had done. Elijah shifted in his seat, looking up at his father. "It's okay, Dad," he said quietly. "I'm used to it." Daniel's face softened as he looked at his son, but there was still a lingering anger in his eyes. "You shouldn't have to be," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. The crowd began to disperse, sensing that the confrontation was drawing to a close. The officers exchanged a glance before stepping back, their posture relaxed but their expressions unreadable. Heather, meanwhile, remained rooted to the spot, her mind racing as she struggled to process the enormity of her mistake. Daniel turned to her one last time, his voice firm but laced with disappointment. "We'll talk later," he said. Then, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder, he added, "Come on, son. Let's go home." As they walked away, Heather was left standing alone, the echo of Elijah's story and Daniel's words ringing in her ears. The realization of her prejudice hit her with the force of a tidal wave, leaving her overwhelmed, ashamed, and utterly exposed. The tension in the park was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Onlookers watched in silence as Chief Daniel Brooks led his son, Elijah, away from the worn wooden chair that had become a focal point of the day's events. Behind them, Heather Morgan stood frozen, the weight of her actions crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Her face burned with humiliation, her chest tight with the realization of her grave mistake. Daniel walked with a calm yet determined stride, his hand resting protectively on Elijah's shoulder. His mind swirled with emotions, anger, disappointment, and a deep sadness for what his son had endured, not only today but for years. When they reached the edge of the park, Daniel paused and turned to face Elijah, his gaze softening. "Are you okay, son?" he asked gently. Elijah nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "I'm fine, Dad," he said, though the slight tremble in his voice betrayed his words. "It's not the first time people have made assumptions about me." Daniel's jaw tightened. And it shouldn't be, Elijah. You deserve better than this. Better than her. Elijah glanced back toward the crowd, where Heather still stood in the same spot, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She's your girlfriend, isn't she? Daniel hesitated, his heart sinking. He had been dating Heather for a few months, impressed by her confidence, intelligence, and seemingly warm demeanor. But today, he had seen a side of her that was impossible to ignore, a side that contradicted everything he believed in. Yes, Daniel admitted, his voice heavy. But what she did today, what she assumed about you, that's not something I can excuse. Elijah nodded again, this time more firmly. Good. Heather's knees felt weak as she watched Daniel and Elijah walk away. The murmurs of the crowd around her grew louder, their judgment pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Some people shot her looks of disapproval. Others avoided her altogether, as though her actions had tainted the very air around her. Heather's mind raced, replaying every moment of the encounter. She had thought she was doing the right thing, protecting the park, safeguarding the community. But now, in the harsh light of reality, she saw her actions for what they were, a product of her own biases and assumptions. The male officer, who had remained nearby, approached her with a look that bordered on disappointment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "I'd suggest you take some time to think about what happened here today. This could have gone a lot worse." Heather opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again. She had no defense, no justification that could make sense of what she had done. All she could do was nod and mumble, "I'm sorry." Later that evening, Heather sat in her living room, her thoughts a storm of guilt and regret. She had sent Daniel a text earlier, asking if they could talk, but he hadn't responded. The silence was suffocating, and her mind wandered to all the things she wished she could take back. When the doorbell finally rang, Heather's heart jumped. She hurried to the door and opened it to find Daniel standing there, his expression unreadable. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple button-down shirt and slacks, but his presence was no less commanding. "Can I come in?" he asked. Heather stepped aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." Daniel entered the room, his movements measured, and sat down on the edge of the couch. Heather joined him, keeping a careful distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Finally, Daniel broke it. "Heather," he began, his voice calm but firm, "what were you thinking today?" Heather's throat tightened. She had rehearsed an explanation, but now, faced with his piercing gaze, the words felt hollow. "I wasn't," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I made assumptions about Elijah, about his intentions, and I acted on them without thinking. I thought I was protecting the community, but I see now that I was wrong." Daniel's expression softened slightly, but the disappointment in his eyes remained. "You weren't just wrong, Heather. You let your biases dictate your actions. You saw a black boy sitting quietly in a park, and instead of seeing a kid who might have a story, you saw a threat. That's not something I can overlook." Tears welled in Heather's eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Daniel. I swear. I thought I was doing the right thing." "But you weren't," Daniel said, his voice growing sharper. "And in doing what you thought was right, you hurt my son. You humiliated him in front of an entire park. And you showed me something about yourself that I can't ignore." Heather's heart sank. "Daniel, please, I can change. I can learn from this. I care about you." Daniel shook his head, his expression pained. "I believe you can change, Heather, but I can't be the one to help you do it. And I can't continue this relationship knowing what you did today." Heather's tears spilled over, and she covered her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Daniel stood, his movements deliberate. "I hope you are," he said, his tone softening. "And I hope you take this as a chance to reflect and grow. But for Elijah's sake, for my sake, I can't stay." Heather didn't try to stop him as he walked to the door. The sound of it closing behind him was deafening, leaving her alone with her regret and the knowledge that she had no one to blame but herself. As Daniel walked back to his car, he let out a long breath, the events of the day weighing heavily on him. He thought of Elijah, of his quiet strength, his resilience. Today had been another reminder of the challenges his son faced, and Daniel vowed to do better by him, to stand beside him more firmly than ever before. Inside her apartment, Heather sat on the couch, staring at her hands. Her chest ached with the weight of what she had done. She didn't know if she could ever repair the damage, but she knew she had to try. Not for Daniel, but for herself. It was time to confront her own prejudices and begin the hard work of change. And at Greenfield Park, under the oak tree, the old wooden chair remained, a silent witness to pain, resilience, and the hope that one day, understanding might replace judgment. The story of what had unfolded at Greenfield Park spread quickly. Within hours, videos of the confrontation began circulating on social media, captured by several onlookers who had recorded the entire incident. The footage showed Elijah's quiet composure, Heather's escalating accusations, and the powerful moment when Chief Daniel Brooks revealed that Elijah was his son and the chair held a tragic significance. The internet was swift and unforgiving, as the clips gained traction under titles like Karen Calls Cops on Police Chief's Son and A Chair of Memories Exposes Prejudice. The online backlash was brutal. Comment threads filled with criticism of Heather's actions, with many questioning her judgment and her biases. Memes cropped up, mocking her attempts to justify herself. One particularly viral clip showed Heather accusing Elijah of being unsettling, followed by Daniel's sharp rebuke. "You didn't bother to ask. You saw a black boy sitting on a chair and decided that made him a problem." The internet latched onto the moment, using it as a rallying cry against racial prejudice and the harm caused by snap judgments. Heather's social media accounts were quickly discovered, and her profiles were flooded with comments. Many were harsh, calling her names and labeling her a bigot. Others attempted to educate her, pointing out how her actions reflected deep-seated biases. Heather's attempts to defend herself were met with even more backlash, and eventually, she deactivated her accounts altogether. For days after the incident, Heather barely left her apartment. The life she had carefully built, a successful real estate career, a budding romance with Daniel, and her image as a respected community member, felt like it had crumbled overnight. She avoided Greenfield Park entirely, unable to face the memories of what had happened there. Even mundane tasks, like grocery shopping or walking her dog, felt unbearable as she imagined the judgmental stares of her neighbors. On one occasion, she overheard two women whispering about her in the supermarket aisle, their hushed voices carrying the words, "Park Karen" and "Daniel Brooks." The weight of her guilt was suffocating. She replayed the events in her mind over and over, each time seeing more clearly how wrong she had been. She remembered the pain in Elijah's voice as he spoke about his mother, the way Daniel had looked at her with disappointment and anger, and the judgment of the crowd. The realization of the harm she had caused was inescapable. Meanwhile, the incident brought Daniel and Elijah closer together. After years of struggling to connect following Melanie's death, the confrontation served as a catalyst for a heartfelt conversation between father and son. Sitting together in their living room a few days after the incident, Daniel turned to Elijah. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there for you more after your mom passed. I didn't realize how much you needed me, or how much I needed you." Elijah nodded, his eyes glistening. "I didn't know how to tell you. Sitting at the park was the only way I felt close to her. I just didn't want to lose that." "You won't," Daniel said firmly. "We'll make sure of that." Together, the two embraced, and for the first time in years, both felt the weight of their grief begin to lift, replaced by a newfound understanding and connection. For Heather, the days of isolation forced her to confront her own biases. She realized that her actions had been driven by assumptions she hadn't even questioned, assumptions about Elijah based solely on his appearance and behavior. She began to see how her narrow worldview had blinded her to the humanity in others, and how her own insecurities had fueled her need to control the situation. Determined to learn from her mistakes, Heather signed up for workshops on racial bias and attended community meetings focused on inclusivity. She knew it would take more than a few sessions to change deeply ingrained attitudes, but she was willing to put in the work. Heather also began volunteering at local organizations, including a grief support group. Listening to others share their stories of loss gave her a deeper understanding of Elijah's pain and the resilience it took for him to sit in that chair every day. The incident sparked a larger conversation in the community. Local leaders and activists used the event as an opportunity to address prejudice and promote understanding. Greenfield Park became a symbol of this transformation, hosting events that celebrated diversity and encouraged open dialogue. Chief Daniel Brooks was at the forefront of these efforts, speaking at public forums about the importance of empathy and the dangers of snap judgments. Though he never mentioned Heather by name, those who knew the story understood the weight of his words. His leadership inspired many in the community to reflect on their own biases and work toward a more inclusive future. Weeks later, Heather found herself back at Greenfield Park, standing on the edge of the playground. The familiar sounds of children laughing and leaves rustling in the breeze surrounded her, but she felt like an outsider looking in. She noticed Elijah and Daniel sitting together on the wooden chair under the oak tree. They were laughing softly, a picture of connection and healing. Heather stayed at a distance, her chest tightening as she realized how much she had hurt them and how much she had lost as a result. Though she didn't approach, she offered a silent apology, a small step toward acknowledging her past and committing to change. Heather wasn't sure if she would ever fully make amends, but she knew one thing for certain. She would carry the lessons of that day with her for the rest of her life. In the weeks that followed the incident at Greenfield Park, the community began to heal, though the echoes of that day lingered in the lives of everyone involved. For Elijah, the park remained a place of solace, but now it was also a symbol of resilience and the strength he shared with his father, Chief Daniel Brooks. For Heather Morgan, the experience marked the start of a painful but necessary transformation. Elijah continued his daily visits to the park, though now he wasn't always alone. Daniel made a point to join him whenever he could, sitting on the weathered wooden chair that had become Elijah's sanctuary. Together, they shared memories of Melanie, her laughter, her kindness, her love for this very spot. One afternoon, Elijah brought a small bouquet of wildflowers to place at the base of the oak tree. Daniel watched silently as his son knelt, his face serene but thoughtful. Elijah's quiet ritual became a source of strength for both of them, a way to honor Melanie while forging a deeper bond between father and son. "I think Mom would be proud of us," Elijah said one day, breaking a comfortable silence. Daniel smiled, his hand resting on Elijah's shoulder. "I know she would be, and I'm proud of you, too." For Elijah, the incident had been a painful reminder of the challenges he faced as a young black man, but it also reaffirmed his determination to rise above prejudice. The park was no longer just a place of memory. It was a testament to his perseverance and his mother's enduring love. Heather, meanwhile, struggled to come to terms with the fallout from her actions. Her relationship with Daniel was over, and the public backlash had left her isolated and ashamed. Yet amidst the pain, she recognized an opportunity for growth. Determined to confront her biases, Heather began attending workshops on racial equity and implicit bias. She listened as facilitators shared stories of systemic discrimination, and slowly, she began to see how her assumptions had been shaped by a lifetime of privilege and narrow perspectives. Volunteering at a local community center further deepened her understanding. She worked alongside people from diverse backgrounds, hearing their stories and learning about their struggles. One day, she met a single mother who spoke about losing her husband to gun violence. Heather couldn't help but think of Elijah and the grief he carried for his mother. It was a humbling moment, one that pushed her to keep learning and growing. Heather also sent a handwritten apology to Daniel and Elijah. While she didn't expect forgiveness, she wanted to acknowledge the harm she had caused. For her, it was a small but important step toward accountability. The incident became a catalyst for change in the community. Greenfield Park hosted a series of events focused on unity and inclusion, with Daniel often speaking about the importance of empathy and understanding. Local leaders used the moment to spark conversations about prejudice and the power of community action. One sunny afternoon, Heather returned to the park, standing quietly at the edge of the playground. She spotted Daniel and Elijah near the oak tree, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Though she didn't approach, she felt a flicker of hope. She couldn't undo the past, but she could keep striving to be better, a journey she now embraced fully. Greenfield Park stood as a testament to healing and growth, a place where pain had given way to transformation and the possibility of a brighter, more compassionate future. The incident at Greenfield Park became a turning point for everyone involved, leaving a lasting impact that went far beyond the events of that day. For Elijah, the park was no longer just a place of grief, but a space of healing. Sitting on the weathered wooden chair, now often joined by his father, he found comfort in the memories of his mother and strength in the bond he and Daniel had rebuilt. The chair became a symbol not just of loss, but of resilience and hope. For Daniel, the experience was a reminder of his role not only as a father but as a leader in the community. He used the moment to spark dialogue about prejudice and empathy, becoming a voice for change and understanding. His determination to protect and guide Elijah deepened, as did his commitment to fostering a more inclusive environment for everyone in their town. Heather, meanwhile, faced the painful reality of her actions. Her biases had cost her a relationship and shaken her place in the community, but they also opened her eyes to the work she needed to do. Though her journey toward redemption was just beginning, she took responsibility for her mistakes and committed herself to change. She understood that true growth required action, not just regret. Greenfield Park, once the scene of tension and misunderstanding, became a symbol of transformation. The conversations it sparked inspired the community to reflect, learn, and grow together. It stood as a reminder that while prejudice could divide, compassion and accountability could heal. In the end, the story of a boy, a chair, and a community's reckoning with its biases became a testament to the power of reflection, growth, and the human capacity for change. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next story. Thanks for watching.